and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in.
Okay, I'm going to kick proceedings off for this afternoon's session. We're going to leave the door open, and the next few moments is mostly me introducing things. So if all of a sudden you're like, crikey, I need some more water or tea or a delicious cake, please use the room and grab stuff before we get into our main session. I should also say I am Verity. Hello, everyone. Who I am. So the next 2 days of our Women in Sport Spotlight, which is being supported by the Institute of Advanced Studies, is part of a larger set of activities that's been happening over the summer, but in particular in August and September in conjunction with the Women's Rugby World Cup. So at the back end of last week, we hosted a summit called the Business of Women's Health and convened a number of partners. So the speakers that are sharing sort of thoughts and ideas of us the next couple of days, including this afternoon, contributed to that as well. So they have been in the UK for quite a while now, and I don't think any of you have stopped yet, and that's all because of me. So just a huge thank you to all the fellows interconnected with this. We've also got a large amount, so for those online, apologies, you won't be able to see this in full, but we've taken a lot of photographs. We've got an exhibition happening in its loosest of forms. So we've got academic posters, we've got some of the equity, diversity, inclusion, impactful Women of Loughborough poster boards. We've got Loughborough Sport pull-up banners, and then we've got some bits and bobs from the School of Design and Creative Arts Degree Show 2025, and some things from Loughborough Lightning. So please, before you exit International House today, just have a chance to have a look round. One of our poster presenters has just walked in the room, so there's a few of us around and about that are interconnected to all of this as well. So the next 2 hours is very much on a specific topic, but if you just want to know more about women in sport in general, we've got lots of ways to engage and follow up with us. Tomorrow we'll be sort of launching the next step of our innovation roadmap, which Dr. Samantha Rowland and Dr. Rebecca Grant in the audience are helping me with, amongst others. We've got a lot of podcasts coming out. So the 3 that are out at the moment are with Karen Carney, the university's health and wellbeing ambassador. If you don't know who Karen Carney is, then just give her a Google. We've got Support in Performance that Becky and Professor McGee did. I don't think Did has joined us yet. And then Networks of Change recently came out, which is with Alex Teasdale, Executive Director of Women's Rugby at the Rugby Football Union, England Rugby, and Dana. One is landing this week, hot off the press, that is from Wheelchair Rugby. So we are not just focusing in on rugby or other topics, we're going across sport. So we've got parasport coming out this week. I've just told you about the summit, and then a number of our fellows have been to a series of games, which Becca and Dana and I will go into a little bit later on. Again, if you're like, how do I get involved? I want to do a podcast. Just join us. We've got lots more going on with the Institute of Advanced Studies. Later in September, we have also got a National Centre for Sport, Exercise and Medicine public lecture from Dr. Karen Jones, who is Chief Medical Officer for Women's Professional Rugby Team, Gloucester, and very heavily involved in England Rugby. That's a hybrid public lecture. And then another few ways that we're sort of going to be encouraging more networking, both internationally and within Loughborough, is part of the Global Observatory for Gender Equality in Sports, a teeny tiny summit happening in Birmingham next year that currently has a call for abstracts. WISAN, which is the Women in Sport and Exercise Academic Network that is being hosted at Loughborough next July. And then our professional women rugby season, so our Loughborough Lightning franchise, kicks off properly in the autumn with their domestic league. So lots of ways for us to get to know each other and learn more about women in sport. Please come in, Jo.
I'm just waiting for my tea.
Excellent. Just me countering.
Priorities.
There are so many people to thank, and I'm going to skim over this slide as I've got this at the end as well. But this whole activation has taken a number of hands, feet, chairs, bands, you name it, and a number of the partners are listed on the screen. But for today, just a huge thank you to Kieran, to Laura, Ksenia, the whole team at the Institute of Advanced Studies that have helped get our international fellows over here, and are also allowing us to take over International House. So just a huge round of applause for the Institute of Advanced Studies. Excellent. So for the next 2 hours, we are going to be discussing what in hindsight is a really clunky title, the collaborative ecosystem of women's sport, a roundtable discussion on the conceptualization, research and innovation agenda. And thankfully, I'm only talking for a small moment of it because you will be hearing from a mixture of Becca, Dana and Lucy, who will all introduce themselves, but super grateful that they can join us in person today. And I'll be acting as a discussant throughout because this is also very close to my research agenda. I'm based in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences, and I specialise in strategic event management. Hashtag Summer of Women's Sport. Generally, we're going to follow this, but we have got plenty of refreshments, bathroom breaks, fresh air breaks. This is not a structured room where you have to sit for the next 2 hours. Please use the facilities, eat all the cake, get lots of cups of tea, come in and out. For those of you online, mute us if you need a break, or indeed get in touch with Kieran on the chat and ask for something to happen. But it is my absolute pleasure to literally hand across to Dr. Lucy Pigott to kick off with our first Fellows contribution. Lucy.
Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Yeah, thanks, Verity. As you'll hear, I'm from the UK and actually did my undergrad at Loughborough, so it's always really nice to be back. But I'm currently based in Norway, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway, where I'm Associate Professor in Sociology of Sport. And most of my research is focused on gender inclusion in sport organisations. And Verity asked me to focus today on how my work in this area has been collaborative, and drawing on some of my research and examples in talking about why I think collaboration is important and useful, and also where I think we need to go next in terms of collaboration on this topic. And I'm then going to sort of segue, hopefully nicely, into more broadly where I think we need to go next in this field. Some of my ideas linking back to the topic of women's sport and health. And I'd really like some of your input and ideas and thoughts on those ideas and future directions. So that will come at the end of the presentation. Okay, so firstly then, why specifically on this topic, gender inclusion in sport organisations is a collaborative approach so important? Well, we heard, for those of you that were there on Thursday at the summit, we heard some Nicole and what was Nicole? So the second
Dr.
speaker.
Nicole Levoy and Anna Gurley.
And Anna, sorry, I forgot Anna's name. So Nicole and Anna were speaking from the Tucker Centre about their experiences of collaboration, and they very much spoke about funding on the one hand at the start, and then dissemination at the end. And for me, there was a bit in the middle there that has been really important for me around the research itself in collaboration and how, in my experiences, it's helped to make my research better, but also have more impact. So I want to start with this notion of research design then, because I think that actually collaborating with organisations right from the start of projects is really important in knowing, okay, so this issue, gender inclusion in sport organisations, it's the individual level, the women themselves, what do they experience? It's also the culture, organisational culture, and also the structure. So what are some of the formal rules? What are the different departments? What are the current organisational priorities, for example? All of those things impact what's going on in the organisation and if women are included within that conversation. So for me, understanding the organisation is absolutely imperative to designing my research, to knowing actually what are the right questions to be asking, who are the right people to be talking to, and which methods are going to be best for me to actually capture the important things within the organisation. So an example of this from my research was the Lawn Tennis Association and England Golf were the two organisations that I researched for my PhD, which was 10 years ago now that I started that. And having conversations with people within positions of power in each of those organisations right at the start was so important. So I sat down with, for the case of England Golf, it was the CEO, and for LTA, it was the head of HR. And they just took me through the organisation. So this is the departmental structure, this is our strategy, these are the events we've got coming up. Like they had a women's leadership development program that was so interesting and important for me to attend. These and even just down to like the language. So by having that meeting, I started to understand this is the language that they use within this organization. I need to adapt my interview guide, for example, to align with that language. So those conversations were really, really important in those examples. If I also look not just in terms of collaboration with the organisations that I'm working with and the research context, but also other researchers and other universities, well, I found that moving beyond research design, research quality is also really important. And an example of that is the research that myself, Jordan Matthews, and Johanna Adrians did with UK Sport. So we were looking at the career pathways of British postholders in international sport governance. For those there on Friday, this is the same project I spoke about, and I gave an example of some findings regarding networking. But something that was unique for this project for me was how we collaborated as a research team, as well as with UK Sport, which I'll talk about in a moment. So you may or may not be able to, well, Jordan is could be both a men's and a women's name within the UK, but Jordan's a man. And it was actually the first time that I've team interviewed before on a project. So Jordan and I sat in every interview together and we split the interview guide between us. And actually we found that on the topic of gender inclusion in sport governance, that was a really effective strategy of collaboration, because it's quite a sensitive topic both for women to talk about if they've had challenging experiences, but also for men, because, you know, if they're feeling, oh, okay, this is a feminist researcher asking me about a male-dominated sphere or culture and things that they might themselves be feeling a bit sort of protective about or vulnerable. Well, the fact that Jordan and I were in every single interview meant that the interviewee was always of the majority gender. So it meant that for the women, they felt safe because I was in the room to share. And for the men, they didn't feel so sort of looked upon as a woman, potentially. And I think having Jordan there helped for them to feel comfortable and be more honest. But then also flipping it the other way around, if a man said something that maybe Jordan didn't pick up as a fellow man, who maybe just thought that's normal, I, as a woman, thought, hang on a minute, that's interesting. I could come in with certain questions and probes. And it might be something that you've all got experience of in your research anyway, but for me, that was a first experience of having a mixed gender interview team, and it was really, really effective. And I think that's something we need to think about more in terms of how, particularly within qualitative research, who is on the team is impacting how our participants feel and the data and the quality of data that we receive. And so that's something that since this project I'm really conscious of and really thinking about moving forward as well. So I suppose that's the research process itself, but then I suppose linking more to what they were talking about on Friday in terms of the impact and creating so-called real-world change from findings, that's where I think going back to cross collaboration with organisations is really important. So on this UK Sport project, I want to say that we were really lucky. So we had someone that we worked with on this project that firstly, she really cared about this topic. And secondly, she had influence to create change. And for me, I don't think you can create change without both. So you need someone who's genuinely dedicated to the project, but also somebody who's got enough power and is senior enough to do something with it. So that's another thing that I'd really recommend when thinking about that. But what UK Sport brought at the end of the project was these pretty infographics for one. So, you know, us as a research team, we didn't really have the capacity to create, I mean, I guess we could have done it if we'd really put our minds to it, but it was nice that UK Sport could add their branding and was able to create, things that would capture people's attention. They also, obviously have networks beyond our networks. So whereas we've got strong academic networks and a certain amount of applied networks, obviously they've got a huge breadth of stakeholders. And they actually created an event to publish or to disseminate our findings amongst others. So key stakeholders of UK sport came to the Etihad Stadium, Manchester City's ground. And it was an amazing opportunity. I wasn't able to be there, but Jordan presented our work, and we got so much interest from key stakeholders on what we'd found, and importantly, how to implement change. And that's the kind of event that, unless you're Verity, you don't normally get to hold as an academic, because we just don't have the same networks that Verity's got. So that was all Loughborough. So that was an incredible opportunity for us to really disseminate our findings. And the nice thing with UK Sport was that it wasn't just disseminating the findings, but they actually committed to implementing some of our recommendations. So these were some commitments that they made on social media around that training programs need to consider the model of networking that we created from our project. We need to review processes for providing financial support to attend international events, because women often have less access than men. Opening a dialogue with more inclusive networking spaces, ensuring support and advice, and also talent ID programs from female athletes to governance positions. So there were 5 clear recommendations that we presented within our report, and they picked these out and really said, we're committed to achieving these. We need to follow up. It's on my to-do list for this semester to actually follow up with UK Sport and understand the extent to which a legacy actually did come from the research. So that's something that we do need to work with moving forward. But I thought the fact that they very publicly made that commitment, that was important to us from our research. Okay, so that's sort of my experiences then of the importance of collaboration. But I think there's definitely a need for more and better collaboration in this area moving forward. So firstly, we really do still see, and myself and Annalise Knoppers have talked about this in a chapter that's just come out in the SAGE Handbook of Qualitative Research in Sport and Physical Culture, in all good bookstores now. So, we found that from our, Annalise has been doing this since the 80s and me for the last sort of 10 years, it's still for the most part white women researching white women, because there's such a focus on the Northern European perspective, Northern American, and Australia and New Zealand. So we need more diverse research teams that are going to bring more diverse, thoughts and questions. All of the business cases that we talk about diversity more broadly, we write about it, but then we don't always do it in our research. So for me, that's a big one. Also, I've already talked about, male allyship, I think, is really important in this field. And particularly Annalise and I, we're writing a conceptual paper at the moment where we want to look at basically men as men within organisations. So often we talk about gender, but in reality it equals women within research. So we talk about gender equality, but we're just interviewing women or focusing on women and their challenges. Whereas we think that actually we need to look more at men, and particularly this notion of homosociability and networking. And in order to do that, we need to think, what's the role of men within research teams in order to not only access spaces, but access the data. So that's something that we're working with more. And then finally, this is something I've had a lot of conversations about over the past 4 days, I think it is, that I've been here. And that's because, so within this topic, we've got a lot of work that's going on at the structural level. So we've got quotas and targets and structural reform. We've got a lot of stuff going on at the individual level, women's sport leadership programs, mentorships, and so on. But it's that cultural level, we were talking about this morning, weren't we, Deirdre? It's the cultural level where it's really still so male dominated, but notoriously difficult to change. And this is one where I think we really need to be working with organisations on, in looking at, okay, where do you want to be culturally? where are you now? What's the gap and how do we bridge that gap? And cultural auditing is something that's going on in other fields. So in performance sport, for example, there's quite a lot of like cultural auditing in non-sport specific settings. But as I'm aware, nobody's doing that in this space on gender inclusion and sport leadership. So I think we can take from other fields and use organisational contacts more in order to really understand what the issues are and how we can change it. So if anyone's got any experience or thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. Okay, so this is the seamless segue. So while I'm talking about the future direction in terms of culture, there's another future direction that I'm starting to explore in this space that's very much linked to the broader topic of women's sport and health that we're talking about at this summit. And it's been really interesting because before I did this, I took this screenshot before I left Norway to come here. And I Googled women's sport health. Can anybody see like what I'm getting at here in terms of what comes up?
Participation.
Yeah, exactly. So every conversation that I've heard at this summit has been about participants or athletes. I don't think I've heard one that is looking at non-athletes, unless it's about coaches informing athletes. And that's not a critique. I think that's so important. Actually, we need more research on this. So I'm not saying we need less of it. However, when we talk about women's sport and health, it doesn't stop at athletes. So what about referees and coaches, TV pundits and leaders? How do issues around the life course, so challenging menstrual symptoms, pregnancy, menopause, how do they impact women in non-sport, non-playing positions? And how do their specific work conditions as referees, coaches, pundits, leaders impact them? And how does the unique sporting context impact them? As far as I'm aware, nobody is really looking at this from a research perspective, which I found quite surprising actually and interesting. But if we look outside of the sport perspective, quite a lot of research being done in Norway in particular. So for example, University of Bergen looking at women's health, menopause and working life, that's a huge project, got loads of funding. And I've got a PhD student in Trondheim looking at the same topic. We can see here women's health at work, specifically within Norwegian high schools. And then here, pregnant bodies, Norwegian female employees in the global working life. So outside of the sports sector, this is a topic of interest, but not within sport. Yeah, in my opinion, like that, I think there's so much that we can look at. And I really want to hear your thoughts about this, and it's something that I want to collaborate on. But we can look at this both from material and immaterial conditions when we look at the workplace and the sport environment. So, physically the workplace environment. So, have we got ventilation that's adequate for menopausal women who are experiencing hot flushes, for example, in offices, or for those in coaching or refereeing positions? How does their workspace being on the football pitch, being on planes, on buses, traveling, how does that impact their experiences? Joe, we were talking this morning, uniform and clothes. So, we know that it's an issue for athletes that is often, and we heard about that on Thursday, rugby kits traditionally being small men's kits that were given to women. So, okay, that's changing for athletes, but what about like coaches? Is there enough ventilation again for women going through menopause for these like heavy materials that coaches often have to wear? And how about pregnant bodies? How do they fit into coaching uniforms and so on? Formal policies, formal requirements and expectations, working hours. Is there flexibility for pregnant women, menopausal women and so on, if they've got challenging symptoms to actually work flexibly? But then perhaps even more interestingly, I think, is the immaterial conditions. So the things that we can't actually physically touch or hold. And in particular, I'm really interested in the notion of the productive body. So within sport, how do we see a successful body in terms of, again, coaching, refereeing? And where does a menopausal woman or a pregnant woman or a menstruating woman fit within that? how does it being still heavily male dominated impact around the cultural norms of whether we have that conversation, how accepted it is to talk about it? Do we have that awareness, both formally and informally? So this is what I want to just get you to spend 5 minutes on your tables just having a chat. And I want you to think, firstly, are you aware of any initiatives on this topic? So the sport workplace, and thinking specifically about pregnancy, menstrual symptoms, or menopause. What's your organisation doing formally about women's health in the workplace? Are you aware of anything? What rights do women have when it comes to health and work? And do you think that your organisational culture enables open conversations about these issues? So it'd be great if you could write, you've got, however you want, post-it notes, you've got pages and whatever, because I'd actually love to take it with me if that's okay, because I'm starting to build these ideas around this research topic. So have a chat, write it down, I'll come and have a chat as well. And yeah, take 5, 6, 7 minutes. We'll move forward, but just to say, yeah, thanks so much for the conversations you've been having, and I'll come and collect them at the end. But yeah, walking around, it was really interesting how still when we're thinking about policy, like for some, it was still coming back to athletes.
Yeah.
Around, so you were saying, Deirdre, the postpartum policy within the WTA, for example, you were like, they're brilliant, they're, you know, leading the game. And then I said, asked, is that the same for coaches and umpires? And said, no, it's just for athletes. So I really think this is an overlooked area in terms of translating some of the policy that's been really hard fought for within athletes for the non-playing roles. And maybe this is a bit of a unique, because initially I was going to ask this question to the sport organisations. So I suppose we've got a bit of a bias sample here being university rather than like sport organisations, which is probably doing better, I would imagine, than sport organisations. But still on the chat, some challenges have come up regarding, so Athena Swan in the UK is a big gender equality initiative, but that's only, I think, for academic staff and not so much for professional staff. So again, when we get into the more sport for sport roles, suddenly there's not the same support. And also the doctoral college. So permanent staff, it seems like, have more support than temporary employees who are already more vulnerable in lots of different ways than permanent employees. So the sort of cycle of privilege just seems to be carrying on. So yeah, if this is of interest to you as well, this focus on women and health within sport organisations, leadership, non-playing roles, just like, please do come and have a chat and let me know your thoughts. But otherwise, yeah, just to say thank you, and any questions at all about anything that anybody's got?
I tend to investigate different cultures, like the same sporting organisation, and then look at that in different countries, and I think you'll find a huge disparity.
Yeah.
I think that would be good to help those women in those countries.
Yeah, in terms of the health focus.
Health focusing, what's provided, what's enabled, and what women have role. Like, are there women in coaching and umpiring?
Yeah, to start with, yeah.
Yeah, are they there?
Yeah.
You know, because if there's not none of them there, no one's care about their health.
Yeah.
And disease.
Yeah, and we were talking about this morning, you were saying that in some of your sessions in some countries you can't even say the word like breast or bra. So then if those words are sort of out of limits, out of bounds, then implementing some of this policy is going to be pretty challenging.
But the way
some of those questions.
Coaches on that,
yeah. Yeah, but to what extent? And it's kind of like, so again, we were talking like, okay, so you need the more basic policies to get women in, but to what extent are these barriers even from women getting in? Like, particularly, you know, stats not from the sports sector with menopause, 25% of women going through menopause, it was this big study based in the UK, either had or considered leaving the workplace due to menopause symptoms, 25%. And when you think about the underrepresentation of women in sport leadership positions and in organisations, like, that's such a huge proportion. So I agree, we need to get women in to start the conversation, but how much of this is actually impacting women getting in? So I just think it's just something we need a whole lot more knowledge about generally. Yeah.
I had a question about the research design, and you're saying about more diverse research teams. It really resonated when you said that the majority of women-only research teams at the moment are white women talking about white women. I really agree. How do we tackle that? So how do we go, even just stating to people that to have a more diverse research team is needed, and then going about finding them? So if I'm a willing researcher that wants to have a more diverse research team, are there anything that's come up in your experiences that have worked, or putting calls out? Because that's kind of the next step, whether it's English as second language or academics that are earlier in their career stage, different genders, academics with diversity of thinking. Like, what do you see as that next step?
Yeah, I mean, I think conferences is a big one. So I've really noticed it since moving to Norway, actually, that when I go to conferences, all the Norwegians or Scandinavians sit together in a corner and they're talking about Scandinavian issues. And then I've sort of self-reflected that I'm drawn towards British scholars. Like every time I go to a conference, I'm either with the Norwegians or with the Brits. And I've just like really reflected on that. So from like a nationality perspective, I think it's about getting outside your comfort zone, talking to a diversity of academics, and then building those networks and relationships. I think LinkedIn is blowing up for academia, and that's a really good way of connecting. And I've had quite a few connections on LinkedIn. And then I suppose just being familiar with the literature in your field. So I'm, pretty well versed in terms of like the literature in this area worldwide, so that I get to know who the key scholars are in Africa, in Asia, in South America. There's not many in South America. So I think it's just sort of getting to understand who's working in your field and then reaching out to them. And obviously there's it doesn't always mean it's going to be fantastic partnerships, but I think it's a good starting point. So they're my suggestions.
Thank you.
So can I build off that and just ask, you specifically said there aren't many in South America. What can we as academics do, not just to encourage women into the sport workplace, but into sport academia, so have women in South America who are taking that on as a topic? What can we do as people who are in whatever position in our career to help advance that? Because then that lets you have your more diverse viewpoints on all the topics.
I think was something for the International Sociology of Sport Association conference. It was in South Korea this summer. And I was part of a mentoring team who we basically provided support for anybody who didn't have English as a first language, in terms of helping them to edit their abstract or to formulate their abstracts to submit and get a better chance of getting it accepted at that World Congress. So I think initiatives like that are really good in terms of having, because again, moving country, I appreciate the privilege we have as English speakers in getting published, in presenting at conferences and so on. So I think things like that are big. I think mentorship's okay, but there's sort of neo-colonialist challenges in my mind around it's not, saying, oh, we're doing great work here, this is how you do it, but working with to understand, cultural sensitivity. Anything from management? Are there, any initiatives that you're aware of for other areas?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges is always, the places where power rests with respect to conferences, with respect to big journals, North America, Europe, Australia. So it falls into the same patterns that you're talking about. And there's something called the World Association of Sport Management. But I mean, there's always the limitation of this year, for instance, it's in Cape Town, which is amazing, but people's funding is so limited. Cape Town is a big, and they're coming from North America in particular, it takes a lot to get there. So, the world is a big place, funding is very little. And so all of these things limit the ability to, get people together. So maybe it's about not concentrating so much power in the major things. And during COVID, we showed that we could be more accessible, we could be hybrid, we could do, synchronous, asynchronous. So integrating that into the big conferences and then trying to develop small groups in smaller places throughout the year that are a little bit more maintainable, but I don't have the answer either, Ellie.
And I think like Sport for Development and Peace organizations in that sector, I think they do a better job of this. and they're like, it's something they're really concerned about. And like sportanddev.org, all of their big publications are in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and I think another language. So I think that's important in terms of calls being really accessible. And the General Secretary of the International Sociology of Sport Association is Brazilian, and also a sport for development and peace scholar. So I think that's a big thing we're thinking about in the international sociology community. So I think starting on some of the smaller things can really help, and then hopefully build out. But yeah, I don't have a really clear answer.
Well, and I know there are governmental challenges there in that there's been a lot of criticism recently, both Canada and the United States, of the difficulty of getting visas. So you have people who are doing work in the field who are coming from another country and they're not able to get a visa. And so, I mean, there's only so much the organization can do on that front, but it's like those larger systemic issues that contribute to it. And then that's why I think maybe that the hybrid model of including people, not just letting them be there in the room to watch presentation, but letting them present in a hybrid manner too, so that they can be disseminators of research rather than just being the ones who are passively receiving that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we ran the Women's Sport Leadership Academy at the University of Chichester, and the visa issue was huge, because we gave scholarship to women within countries where they experienced particular economic challenges, and also staggered the fee system so it was accessible, hopefully, for everybody. But it's still, for some of those from the most economically challenged countries, visas was the biggest issue. So that is such a challenge. So you're right, it's then acknowledging that challenge and saying, okay, how do we work around it to ensure they're still included? So I think that's an important one.
Kelsey had a question, and then Lily. Kelsey, your question still stands?
Not so much, but slightly different question. In your research, when you did the mixed gender interviews, how did you kind of come to that conclusion for that research question? Was that just the team formulated that way, or did you guys make a conscious effort to make sure it was mixed? And then from what you learned from that, I don't know if there's any data available, this might just be my lack of knowledge of qual, but is there like, from your outcomes when you said you got a lot of valuable insights from males, have we got information that says that like available for like academic? I'm just thinking about our work and stuff, we don't make like a conscious effort to always think about like gender or whatever, so I'm just curious what there is out there at the moment.
So to answer your first question, so the research team was already formulated. Jordan and I did the first iteration of that research, and then Johanna came on for the next stage. So that was, I suppose, coincidental. Jordan was one of my PhD supervisors. He's done a lot of work in this area. And then it was when we came to design the research and that we were doing the interviews, the easy option would have been to him to have done half, me to have done half in terms of time efficiency. But we actually sat down and said, you know what, I think because of this gender dynamic, because I think we bring really different perspectives and ideas, we think it's going to be really effective to then have both of us in the interviews. And it was such a positive experience, and I would really recommend it. The method section for that paper, we talk about it in a bit of depth, but sorry, get the paper up. Oh yeah, that one. So within the method section for that, we talk about that we did this and why. So, but it's in a method section, so it's not a whole chapter. But then in this chapter, Annalise and I talk about it in more depth in terms of gender dynamics within research teams and why it's important, and particularly for the topics going forward on men and masculinity. So sorry, that's I shouldn't be apologising after our motivational speaker, but that was a self-plug. But we wrote about it because we didn't know that anybody else was. So I'm not sure about anybody else, but if anyone else knows, then please.
I'm just curious because, me and you talk about it all the time, but then I think I sometimes consciously want to have women on a team, but am I then almost like going in the wrong direction by doing that as well? Like I want to have women on the team because obviously we all want to bring each other up, but now I'm thinking, should I try and make a conscious effort, especially after, I guess, what Rich was saying when we put the, women's leadership in female health. are we almost like going in the wrong direction sometimes with research?
Just to link to that, or to add on the thought that we've had in our department, is quite a lot of us are doing PhD projects at the moment that are like female focused. So all the participants in some of the projects that are proposed are going to be female. And there's this perception from male and female colleagues that the candidate would be better served if they were female. And that blows my mind, that you should think that they have to be female to do female-based work. But that's a commonly shared perception. So I think there may be cases where that helps, it may be cases where it hinders, I don't know. But yeah, we're almost like trying to force it sometimes. Like, should we add a female? Should we add a male? Like, just let it kind of be, and everyone be comfortable with what it is, and work with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we don't always as academics like sit down. So with like data analysis, we really sit and work with it, and it's like really structural and like process driven. But when we come to research design and thinking about these details, like sometimes it kind of just happens and we just start the research, not always. But I think it's really about like sitting down and really considering, like you would with your methods or your instruments or whatever, like what is the research question here? What's most important in terms of the data I'm collecting and the quality of it? And then what does a female only team bring? A mixed team, a male only team, or man only team? So I think it's just really considering what those impacts are and weighing it up. But for us with this topic, where we're looking at, you know, gender inclusion is both men and women, and gender dynamics and power and so on, it really was effective for us. And then, I think if we ghettoise it as a women's issue, because men, you know, do still have power and capital, then I think maybe it doesn't get as much legitimacy. So it's always a way up. And I think, you know, women-only spaces have been effective in their own right in certain instances, but I think it's just weighing up the pros and cons. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting you talk about diverse research teams, because I was also presenting this at the Liaison conference.
You were indeed.
And I think we kind of came to this conclusion around a paper was done on that a while ago from Fletcher and Leeds Beckett, which said no matter if you're an insider or outsider, meaning if you match an identity for the people you're interviewing, for example, or if you don't match an identity, information is going to be missed. So to bridge those those insider and outsider gaps, it's better to have a diverse research team to produce more meaningful research than whether that's not just male and females, but looking at, you know, well, depending on who the target population is, age, geographical location, educational background, religion, and so on. So yeah, that was just something I wanted to build on from that. And then one of my questions was around, you've done a lot of research on gender over there since your PhD.
Yeah.
Have you got any aims or kind of ideas to go beyond gender to then look at that intersection approach? I know you've done one paper on that already, but what's like, how could you bring in something more, you know, looking at race, for example, when you're looking at the female health agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. And the intersectional perspective is something that I think is going to be so, you know, as Deirdre also mentioned, like different cultures, races, you know, sexualities, so on and so on. Like, I think that that's going to be so important with health specifically, because not only like physical symptoms and challenges, but also in terms of culture, how we talk about these things. So, I mean, it's a pretty basic answer, but yes, absolutely. I think that's going to be central to this work going forwards. And then in terms of, so the UK sport piece, like that, we absolutely came to that from an intersectional perspective, but the sample was so uniform. The intersectionality was something that still came out, and particularly with the networking, we talk about some findings relating wheelchair users and how networking spaces where everybody's standing, particularly like cocktail events, for wheelchair users, it's completely inaccessible. And actually, even it's such a barrier, a cultural barrier, because people are afraid to go and talk to a wheelchair user because they don't know whether to crouch, sit next to them, whether to bend over and stand. And actually, people are so afraid sometimes of getting it wrong that they don't even try. So that was an interesting intersectional finding that came from this. But they were all white British post holders. So race didn't really come into it, and ethnicity. Even though we could have, I appreciate, had come at it from a lens of privilege and so on. But the networking paper, that didn't come through so much. And I've written a paper on esports organisations and esports leadership, and that was completely rooted in intersectionality. both from men and women. So that's a paper that was rooted in it. But yeah, it's so important, and particularly with the health piece. So yeah, thanks for that.
You raise a really good point there around like kind of homogeneity of samples. I think whenever I've recruited for studies, I don't know if it's because I'm a white woman, but I invariably end up with white men and white women. I really struggle to access anybody else, and I have no idea really what I need to do differently.
Yeah.
If you have any advice on that, please share it.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know how to get a more diverse sample, and it's also challenging because science in the world that I work in works in small samples.
Yeah.
If you introduce variability, that can make it harder to answer a question if you're trying to answer it across all those elements of intersectionality as well.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult one.
Yeah, and I think it very much depends on the sampling. So for the UK Sport Project, we literally, for the first bit was a survey, and it was with every single senior post holder, British senior post holder in international federations, and every single post holder was white. So it was actually, that was beyond our control because that was the sample. But in terms of broader sampling, I mean, I think again, it's diversity within your research team, thinking about where you're hosting, where you're advertising the study, how you advertise, the different networks in that sense, if you can use more diverse networks to get out your call for participants and that kind of thing. So I think, similar to what we talk about with recruitment, I think there's similar strategies, like as in recruitment for jobs. I think there's similar strategies we can take in research as well.
I think even translating apply.
Yeah, translation. So yeah. And that's so easy to do now with Google Translate, DeepL. Yeah.
There's barriers to them then participating in research. So like think about all the visits to Loughborough, for example, depending on where they're based. If it's someone that's like of black descent, they're typically paid less. So actually the barrier for them might be they can't take the day off work to participate in the research, or they need that money. So there's other barriers as well. So I don't think that's a you thing because you're white. I think that's just a access to research. Like there's maybe a gap.
With international sporting events, when we were doing survey for teams, we had two other people who sat with, who just, just put up with, hey, can I do it with you? Like, didn't say you having trouble with the language, just said, I sit down, I'll chat to you and try and do this with you. So that got them to the survey, otherwise they just, not interested, it's too hard. So you just make it social and not say anything. We never actually said that we presuming that, it's hard for you. But it was just a goal thing doing it together. But I suppose I had a question I wanted to ask you about. I wonder with support staff in sporting organisations, having been one myself, I would never have asked for any allowance for me. Like I've travelled with the team and pumped my breasts in sitting on the toilet and had my own esky and carried it around, got my own ice, never thought about any consideration for me. So I wonder, it would be interesting to get the perspectives of these support staff. Do they think that they're entitled or they should be asking or having? Because I think most of them will go, what do you mean we're here for the athlete? Everything's for the athlete. It's not for them. We have a different mentality working in sport.
Yeah, but then so much, like we have such a big conversation around the underrepresentation of women in these roles. And I'm guessing like if you had a safe space to breastfeed, you would have taken it.
Yeah,
if it was there. Yeah.
And you shut up. But I also wouldn't have thought, I'm not the women I know who are coaches or who are umpires or physios working in sport, they would not think that the sport should look after their health. They wouldn't do that.
Why is that, do you think?
Because I think we all think we're support staff for the athletes. We support the athletes. The organisation supports the athletes. I don't think they think the organisation supports them. And
I think that's a big problem.
So I think to investigate that, because that's my perception.
Yeah, and that's really good to know and fascinating. And I think that's then like a greater narrative change around like the legitimacy that we give to the experiences of women coaches and umpires and so on, because of the impact they have on athletes as well, not just themselves. So I think it can.
But also that those roles, those volunteers, that's their whole social network. Like they spend their life with that sport. So if for their mentors, they pull out. Their social networks pull out.
Yeah.
So like there's flow-on repercussions for these women, because you're exactly right, there's so many managers and coaches who are old when the kids are finished and they have time to devote.
Yeah, and particularly for leadership positions. So I think, such a big barrier that is talked about is children and pregnancy and being mothers. But then when you have the experience and the knowledge and potentially the time to get to a leadership position when the kids have left, that's where menopause hits.
Yeah.
So if all of those barriers that we talk about are gone, but then you've got brain fog and you need to give a presentation at an international congress, how does that impact women, or hot flushes, or lots of different symptoms that sleeplessness, huge, huge.
Where they can,
Yeah,
so they would even think, because I think the focus is in.
Yeah.
I don't think they think the organisation should look at it. I don't think they'd ask.
But I find that so problematic.
But so that's why I think that would be interesting to
definitely
to explore, to go and that's the case.
Yeah, and I'd like to come at it from different angles. So those experiences, leader experiences, organisational policy and structures and culture, I think it needs to be quite an all-encompassing project. So yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Massive round of applause for Lucy.
I can see in the room that brains are whirring and people are taking this in, so thank you all. We're just kind of taking questions from Lucy. We are going to allow people to have a leg stretch. It's been raining, it still is raining, but there's lots of cookies, water. If we could be sat, keep this quite rapid, if we could be sat for just after 3:10, that would be amazing. For those online, again, please take a little digital break. You've got a few claps online, Lucy. So following on from Lucy's opening half and her interpretation of the roundtable sort of crux, not sure that word works, but we're okay with that word. We're now going to move into another domain that intersects and is again from kind of more social sciences, but I think we'll speak to diversity of people online and the diversity of people in the room. The one thing that struck me when the sort of international multidisciplinary conversation just happened was Lombe and Haley and the Global Observatory for Gender Equality in Sport. If you haven't heard of this, we'll make sure that we flag it at the end. They are also having a conference, is that what they call it? They're not a summit or anything, in September. But they also have a really lovely website where you can get involved, and it's not just for social scientists, it's for all the sciences and all practitioners. So yeah, we'll mention that at the end. Lombe and Haley were trying to be here, but couldn't quite hologram them in. So I would love to now introduce Dana and Becca, and I will keep shepherding people in as they top up teas. But over to yourselves.
All right. Thanks, Verity, again for organizing, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. We are going to be moving in a very completely different direction, and we're going to be looking at some work that is ongoing. We're traveling from here to Budapest tomorrow to present some of the same study. So it's a little bit more kind of conference presentation-y in style. We're kind of giving it parts of it anyway, a dry run. So we are going to talk specifically about what we are calling the collaborative ecosystem of sporting events. So this is a project that myself, Becca, and Verity are working together on. It is meant to be a kind of large overarching project. We will not try and talk for hours today to you and get into all the small parts of it, but we are basically going to focus in on kind of the details of what the project looks like, but then put it into a Women's Rugby World Cup perspective based on some of the observations and things that we've seen in the last few days since we've been here. So to keep it on track in that way. So as we said, agenda, pretty straightforward conference presentation type stuff. Introduction, purpose, literature review, method, results, implications, and conclusion we won't really get into, and we will be kind of tight and focused when we're talking about all of these initial elements. So the reason why this project came to fruition is that sporting events as a whole of any size are somewhat at an inflection point. They're in the middle of an ongoing evolution, and part of the reason why that is the case is there are a few struggles that exist right now. There is the struggle to maintain growth. So as with anything, there is a constant need, or there is perceived to be a constant need for the next event to be bigger and better than the previous one. So obviously that leads to growth in not just what the event looks like, but in how much the event costs and the impact that it has, whether that is positive or negative. Alongside that, particularly when you're talking about some of the biggest events, which tend to be the type that we study as researchers, that means we are finding less and less cities, less and less countries that are willing and able to host. So more often we start to see people in countries saying, yeah, we don't want the Olympics. Maybe we enjoy watching them on TV, we enjoy cheering on our athletes, but that's a lot to take on from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and that's not how we see the best use of our taxpayers' dollars. And so that's a carry on from kind of this need to maintain growth. Part of what is an issue here is the inability to procure the promised legacies. One of the responses to this growth has been this need to say, okay, the event is coming, and what's going to be left over after the event is gone? There's been many years now of that being the be all and the end all, people having to make those promises, but we've also now been long enough watching legacy to know that a lot of these promises never really come to fruition in the way they say they will, particularly around things like, oh, we're going to build, the athletes' village is going to be turned into affordable housing. Inevitably, 10 years down the line, there may be, if you're lucky, a token number of affordable apartments, but if it's been turned into anything at all, usually it ends up as some sort of luxury apartment accommodation area. So there has been issues with respect to what's been promised and then what's actually been delivered. And then ultimately, as a result of all of these things, there is a move towards trying to reduce the social and economic footprints of events. And so what we understand and what we have seen as we've been watching over the last little while is that rights holders are reorienting their efforts. They're reorienting the way they think about putting on events with a view towards enhancing resilience and with a view towards enhancing long-term sustainability. So if places aren't willing to host anymore, what does that mean for events? So how are people changing their mindset in an effort to deal with that particular issue? So one of the ways that we have looked at it is that a key in this has been and will continue to be collaboration. Discussion of collaboration from an event perspective is not new. Events, particularly the larger ones, the World Cups, because of their nature, they are inherently global. And when you have a global and a large event, then you have a large range of stakeholders that collaborate across that event. When we reach the place where we are in now, where we have these threats to long-term sustainability, then we start thinking about that collaboration in a different way and maybe expanding what the promise of collaboration is in enhancing the long-term viability. So overall, our purpose today is to conceptualize the collaborative sport event ecosystem and make an initial case for its existence at the macro level. So we're really focusing in on this as one part of the larger project that we're undertaking. If we look at some of the literature, and I won't go through it all, but interorganizational relationships, obviously not new. Lots of people out there have studied it for a long time. Sport event literature in particular calls it networks, strategic alliances, partnerships, relationships. All of these are different types of collaboration. If we look specifically at issues, we see interorganizational relationships, stakeholders, networks, partnerships, etc., talked about in these contexts. So stakeholder coordination, event leverage and delivery, joint hosting, corporate social responsibility, sponsorship. So there's been many different places across which collaboration has been discussed in some form or another. So I'll leave it to kind of Verity to kind of go into the methods a little bit, but we're practicing our presentation mojo here.
Yes, and I'm not going hungry, so
Yeah.
this is, yes. Okay, so methods wise, I will be presenting the next couple of slides because we have gone very hard into documentary analysis, and that is one of my areas of methodological specialisms. And the reason why we've focused in on documents is because, as Dana's outlined, our goal is mostly conceptual. We didn't necessarily need empirical evidence to initially start to sketch out what some of our conceptual thinking was. And there's already, as Dana outlined, quite a lot been said on this topic. So what I'm going to sort of look at and show you in the next couple of slides is how we picked up on some of these patterns and connections and started to gather what is quite a large amount of data in the end. The first thing is that events and an event ecosystem, when you actually start to list, even just in your own brain, and you go beyond the Olympic and Paralympic Games or the FIFA Men's World Cup, sort of the biggest and topmost events, there's a lot of them. And when you start to make that into a global scale and scope, there is a huge amount of events that you could include in this. So what we did in phase 1 as a research team, so we identified in some of the design elements Lucy was bringing up that we did some member checking, is that we started to build boundaries of what events we were going to include in this initial phase. And we decided from an organisational perspective to focus in on international federations of sport because they are the rights holders to the World Championships. So, for example, FIFA, the federation that governs world football, is the rights holder to the men's, women's, youth World Championships, and they own the ability for someone to go and bid and host. Okay? The next stage, once we started to form that plan and member check that, was to think about how we were going to gather documents, what types of things we were going to review. Did that then go back against some of our conceptual thinking, reflect and refine, and then we're kind of getting to the point of being able to analyse and present. So as Becca and Dana will come on to, the presentation today is a bit more experiential because we've just been at a live site, but the majority of this study, when we actually come to write it up, is going to be based on documents, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail now. Very, very, very important source of data. If you're a doctoral researcher in my school, you have heard me talk about this last week. Apologies that I'm slightly repeating myself. When we say a document as a source of data, here are a couple of examples. And these are often used in studies as supplementary material or starting materials. So you begin to understand a system, a context, a background to what you are looking to explore, interrogate, examine. So I'm not going to read these out on screen, but a couple of my highlights that I use a lot in my research are photographs. I use a lot of descriptive statistics that have been gathered by other organisations. I use a lot of institutional documents, press releases, official reports. And then obviously we've gone into the realm of social media. Okay, so you wouldn't include all of these in one study, but if you're building that into your design, especially an equitable design, as Lucy touched on, you'd need to think through where you were getting your documents. And they are, in my view, a very valuable source of data. I'm not going to go through 1 through 19, but this is often questioned as a rigorous method. People are like, oh, well, you've just Googled something and then written a paper. And that's when I would insert a very large swear word. It's not. It is incredibly methodical. You can have protocols, you have samples, exactly the same as other studies. It is just that you are looking not to engage with a human, but your human is the documents, okay? So this is all very legitimate and I love documents.
So I can talk a little bit about our search. I'm not going to go into detail because I know this looks incredibly confusing and methodology is not what we're here to talk about. But just as an understanding of what it is we did, we looked at our search in 2 steps. Our first step was identifying all the IFs. Then we identified all of the, so IFs being international federations, then we identified all of the world championships associated with those federations in the last 10 years. We limited this to those which operate within the Olympic disciplines and the Paralympic disciplines. So even if an IF had other events out in events that were not Olympic disciplines, we didn't look at those, we limited it to Olympic disciplines. And then we looked at men's and women's in each case. Then what we did is we took that 10-year time period and we broke it down into 3 separate time periods. So pre-COVID being 2015 to 2019, post-COVID 2021 to 2025, and future, which is 25 plus. The reason why we did this is to allow us to try and not have to look at every single event, but to make sure that we had a good sample across that time. So I'm not going to go into it, but this is what it looked like when it comes into place. So International Volleyball Federation, all of their world championships, they have these in particular for events. So they have beach as a separate discipline, and then they have men's and women's. And then those are all the events that took place in those time periods for that event. Step 2 is us trying to limit this down. So you're going to see a slide where we talk about how many events there are that are covered by the definitions we gave for those boundaries. So we wanted to choose one event that represented each type of event in each time period. So that means all applicable Olympic and Paralympic disciplines, female and male events, and Paralympic events. So when we're talking about World Rugby, what that means for World Rugby, all association championships, they have separate men's and women's events. They have the 3, and where we're focusing in today here is in the post-COVID era. These were all the events, and we focused in on here. Now, for the rest of our study, we will be focusing in on all of those on that side, but we didn't want to put that in there. Ultimately, what we came up with, in total, there was 46 international federations, 605 events from those. And so through our second step of selection, we ended up with 202 events in particular that we're looking at. The UCI, the FIS, and World Curling were those that hosted the most events. So in the last 10 years, the UCI has hosted 79 different events. And that's partially the result of the fact that they have many disciplines. Similar with FIS or skiing and World Curling as well. Jointly hosted events, so talking about our kind of topic of collaboration, joint hosting is kind of a new trend. And so within that, 22 events were joint hosted between multiple countries. So it's not unusual for multiple cities, but multiple countries hosting was 22. If we separate it out into kind of discipline areas, there were 23 organizations that represent only Olympic disciplines, summer and winter, with 264 events. Paralympic only, we had 10 organizations with 67 events, and then a combined Olympic and Paralympic organizations were 13 with 274. In total, there were 48 women-only events, 49 men's-only events, and 508 mixed events. So this is just kind of to get an idea of where the data set started. And so even though today we're talking about a very small subset of that with respect to the Women's World Cup, it's being informed by what we know here, as is the rest of the conceptualization. So basically, this is about our case setting for our understanding today. Verity, do you want to put the video on?
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, because I'm not going to presume everyone in the room knows, we are in the midst of, oh no, Kieran, you don't need to do that. You just keep it on the, just keep it.
Do it in the slides.
Yeah. Those of you that don't know, we're currently in the midst of a Women's Rugby World Cup, and, oh, I've now done something. This is why you never embed videos. So we are in Loughborough geographically, and about an hour that way, as the crow flies, is Northampton, and they are a host town for the Rugby World Cup. There's a number of different host places, and Northampton is just one of them. Whilst Kieran's fixing our PowerPoint, which has gone awry, we're going to play a video that gives you a snapshot to what Northampton are doing. The other reason for involving Northampton is that at Loughborough University, we have a number of semi-professional or professionalised women's sport franchises, including Rugby Union, and Loughborough Lightning Rugby Union is partnered with Northampton Saints Rugby Club, which is in Northampton. So there is method to this madness, and I'm hoping we can play a video whilst we figure out other bits and bobs. Just let me put the video on whilst you're doing that.
Yeah, it's now sharing that screen.
I didn't come this far just to come this far. The wind tears at my heart, but I'm dedicated to my craft and raising the bar, rising as fast as the burning flames of glory as they paint our story onto the pages of history. I am bravery, I am unity. I am part of a team that literally walks in the footsteps of royalty. We are nobility. From a shoe town built on the souls of warriors, forged from a silver stone racing towards our destiny. Would you follow us if we fell? If we lost our way but we started again and found our way back towards the heart of the game? Would you dance in the rain? Our path is ingrained and this is part of our DNA. We are the rose of the shires. We rose from a fire with hope in our eyes and reached part of the sky where nobody flies, on the shoulders of giants. Express your courage, lift your head up high, tower over your antagonists. We play where the shadow is. But that shadow is our advocate, steadfast and compassionate, highly esteemed, a guardian that watches over a field of dreams, handed down through the generations, through the lowest of lows and through elevation. There's a castle on our chest and lions with wings, and a halo on our head, so we rise like a phoenix. For she has been chosen to carry our legacy from here to the ocean. She's not just one. She is part of a union, like a demi-goddess who's only partially human. She grits her teeth, determined and brave. She's pictured this day, stood on a world stage. She represents you, she represents diversity. She has overcome setbacks, challenge and adversity. Like an Amazon warrior, she came here to win. In the west of Northants, let the games begin.
All right, so as we switch back, we're just recognizing, for the purpose of what we're going to talk about today, this is kind of the context in which the Women's Rugby World Cup was examined. And so we looked specifically at things that were happening at this level that speak to what we're trying to understand about collaboration and sport events. So first of all, when it comes to our initial COEE conceptualization, so COEE stands for Collaborative Event Ecosystem. Our collaborative sport event ecosystem is made up of exists over, exists within, consists of many levels. We're still trying, as we conceptualize, to figure out kind of what wording is most representative of what these relationships look like and how they can be described. But ultimately, the point is that they exist on, with, or over multiple different levels, specifically the macro, the meso, and the micro. And so while today we're talking about the macro, it is not interconnected from the meso and micro levels. And so when we're looking at what we mean when we're talking about collaboration and the characteristics of collaboration in this context, we've put together some kind of understandings or some initial understandings of what really this means. So the first is that it's made up of a coalition of any number of willing fields. That is, at the macro level, we're looking at fields. And so those fields come together in any number. It might be a coalition between 2, it might be a coalition between 10, but ultimately those relationships come together. It emerges as a result of internal and external pressures. It's not a completely internal issue, but it also can be impacted externally by what's going on in its external environment. Not every field is linked, and links are not uniform. So just because different fields exist at the macro level, it doesn't mean that every field is connected to every other field, and it doesn't mean that the strength of the connection between one field and another is necessarily even. The ecosystem itself is flexible and it's adaptable and it's constantly evolving. So while we may look at the ecosystem today and say it looks one way, we could look at that same ecosystem a month from now and it might be different. There might be new partners, there might be partners that have exited that, there might be new connections, the strength of the connections may change, and that again is as a result of those internal and external pressures. It also has varying temporal boundaries. So within the sport event ecosystem, what that looks like and how it comes together and how long it lasts could change. So some might be enduring, something that is ongoing, but as we all know with sport events, they by themselves are not enduring. And so maybe the connection only lasts as long as the event lasts, or maybe it lasts even shorter than that. So the boundaries of those connections can change in time. Multiple fields function autonomously and interdependently towards interconnected outcomes. So it doesn't mean that everything that they're doing is bound up in each other. They have their own autonomous goals. They're working towards those goals, and they do work interdependently towards some sort of shared and interconnected outcomes within that context. And lastly, one of the keys would be open communication, facilitating any flow of information between the different fields in that context. So those are some characteristics of what we understand about the collaborative sport ecosystem and the connections within it. So as we said, our initial focus here is on the macro level. And so what we mean by the macro level is basically undertaking collective actions with various fields towards solving problems. We are using fields in the management specific context. So we are using Scott's institutional fields definition as the way of framing our understanding of a field at this time. So what we mean by a field is those organizations that in the aggregate constitute a recognized area of institutional life. So key suppliers, resources, product consumers, regulatory agencies, and other that produce similar service or products. So it is all of those organizations. They're different, they have different goals, and as we said earlier, they function autonomously, but within this certain context and towards this certain goal, they're working and functioning together, and that is around sport events. So when we look at what we have seen in the data, but also specifically on the ground today, or in the last few days, we have the macro fields that have been identified. Now, our guess is these are probably not a surprise to anyone. I think most people would understand and recognize that there are interconnections here. So some of the major fields we've seen interaction with are environment, technology, economic, health, education, society, sport, arts and culture. And so the first step for us was just trying to understand at the broadest level possible what fields are interconnecting with sport events. In order to bring it into today's context a little bit more, to talk a little bit about the Rugby World Cup, we're also going to talk a little bit about what it looks like at the micro.
So somehow I picked the long straw on this presentation, and I get to talk about all the pretty pictures while you guys dealt with intro theory and methods. So what I wanted to do in my portion of the presentation was kind of highlight some of the things we saw that kind of represent collaborations in each of those 8 kind of field level areas we just identified in the macro environment. So the first one being arts and culture. So we saw things like when we visited the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery that they have a Scrum exhibit, kind of making that connection between, you know, the Rugby World Cup and the arts and culture scene. We see a lot of crafting and arts being displayed to kind of be a welcoming reminder and like welcoming people to the city for the particular event. And then we actually were taking pictures of the volunteer uniform because we learned over the weekend that the actual design of the volunteer uniform, they particularly or specifically asked someone within the local community to work on the design elements of that uniform, which is actually very popular and very cool. And I think people are really loving the look and feel of the volunteers from the Rugby World Cup. I prefer this. So let's talk about the economic kind of field level. So economics kind of one of those ones where we're like, okay, we'll include business for now within kind of the economic field. And so some of the things we were seeing were kind of businesses activating their collaborations with the particular event. So this is, I learned the it's oxygen. What's the actual name of
O2.
O2? It's straight up O2. But I loved the idea that they had the Red Roses logo instead of their own symbol. And I think being close to the fan zone really kind of made, without any wording about the Women's Rugby World Cup, you made that connection. I mean, I'm from a different country and I was like, oh, that's a really cool way to kind of make that collaboration between business and the economic field and the event. And then while I did not actually drink from a bottle, I drank from a cup. We have an example of Asahi being the beer sponsor for the event and kind of recognizing right on their labeling that connection to collaboration with the event. In terms of education, lots of examples we saw over the weekend. So we've obviously are partaking in an education example. So we have a picture there, kind of disseminating related research to the field. There were also the mural kind of educating, I'm assuming this is the group of school children there kind of learning about the Women's Rugby World Cup. There's also a picture there of there was a picture competition to kind of win prizes and kind of describing what the Women's World Cup meant to the school children in the local location. And also we kind of have internship opportunities associated. So we kind of saw those as collaborations representing the education field around this particular event. Health, we're all here to talk about health. So again, we threw in a picture of the business of women's health, because obviously we're seeing collaborations between the event and the health sector. Honestly, we were so surprised, but not only having kind of the menstrual products in the bathrooms at the facility, but the amount, it was actually overwhelming how many they had just available in the facilities, which might have been maybe a new endeavor for them, but we're still seeing those collaborations between health and the sport event. We've got the society field level, so I think everyone's loving the contribution of the Women's Institute in Northampton and what they were able to do to kind of help activate the event. So you see craft, knitting, and all things that they thought they could do kind of as a handicraft, kind of contributing to the atmosphere in Northampton. So we've got some of their logos there, but also the ladies placing up some of their art and creations around the city. And then also some other programs that have been developed about getting kind of women's and daughters and moms and daughters into the sport of rugby in particular. In terms of the environment, a couple different initiatives. I got to experience both of these, but not only did we kind of all go together in Verity's car and car park and walk to the event, but we also got to give it a try bus. So that 2-pound bus, I think it was per person, to get us from kind of the fan zone area over to the facility and back. But it was kind of a cool, kind of very inexpensive, very easy to get around modality between the fan zone and the facility. That was a little bit, probably a 35-minute walk from downtown. So some encouraging of some environmentally friendly ways to get, or methods of transportation to actually get to the event. In terms of sport, I think we can see some crossovers and collaboration between different sport and the Women's Rugby World Cup. So we've got Verity there. It was either her holding the rugby ball or her holding the picture frame, but obviously there's some collab between Loughborough Lightning and the Women's Rugby World Cup. But we've also seen a crossover sport to sport. So we've got Chloe Kelly here kind of representing the Lionesses and their crossover to supporting the Red Roses at the event, which is a very kind of picked up on social media important moment, I think, during the tournament, just to see women supporting women in different sports. And then we also see the technology field, kind of where collaborations are happening there. So this was actually Twinkle. Verity's been all about it all weekend long. It's about the fact that there is an education documents and platform available online to include kind of information about the Women's Rugby World Cup, but also even one of the weekends that was planned in terms of the fan zone had a technology kind of theme where they had video game options in terms of kind of having access to those downtown, and also bringing even those, well, I think look like the Transformer, but I think is some sort of big technological robot.
Well, anecdote about that, I misunderstood and thought it was an actual robot because we have a robotics department. So
It's a human in
it's
that.
a human in a suit. And I was very literal.
I think it's something about where we are in our culture that we could think it could be a robot and it could be.
I mean, you have holograms, so.
Go figure, I've seen events in Japan. If it was a robot in Japan, it'd be legit.
It would travel the
Yes. So I think it's interesting because we actually kind of came up with the field levels. We had already taken the photos of all the things we were thinking that were interesting about the event over the weekend. And we were literally very easily be able to share our photos, and we had very great examples of all of the different fields collaborating without even thinking about it as this was an afterthought to present it this way, in the sense that it was very easy to see kind of the collaboration at the macro level between the fields that we've identified and the sport event itself. So I'm going to hand it back over to Verity to kind of turn it over to you guys.
Yes, I've got one more point to make because I've now figured something out in the midst of this presentation. The beauty of doing live event research. The economic one has been a point of the business of women's health has triggered a lot around economics and business side, obviously. So those of you who's been to the stadium, who's been to Franklin's Gardens, okay. Did any of you sit on a seat that had like black material?
Yes. Is it the Carlsberg one? I just figured that out.
Okay, so
I'm
the
totally
video,
gonna bring that out.
the video that is a West Northamptonshire Council video. It shows the stand, and Joe will be able to say this. During the season, it's a Carlsberg
I figured that out during this presentation as well.
I thought it was like something white for.
I thought we were like,
Honestly,
I was like, oh, we're like extra VIP. No, we were totally extra VIP. That's why I thought we had the black in there.
The thing that we'll come on to as this project progresses is where the collaborative events ecosystem, there's also, it's not just positive and fantastical and look what's going on, but there's also really big negative consequences for certain collaborations. For example, Carlsberg sponsors Franklin Gardens, the stadium, but for the tournament time, which is owned by a commercial partnership with Asahi, which funnily enough did not do 0% alcohol, anybody in Asahi listening, very uninclusive, that had to be covered up. So that's why we sat on black seat covers. Anyway, that just came to me as I watched the video. That's why, there we go. Okay, now over to you. Again, if you want some fresh air and refreshments and to sort of chat in these micro conversations, fantastic. But what we'd really love to hear, having sort of presented this macro, so the overarching sort of keywords, is whether across the summer of women's sports, so not just rugby, if you've watched the tennis on television, if you've been lucky enough to go to any of the Euros over the summer, apologies if you're Spanish in the room, then where have you seen some of these collaborations or ways in which what we're identifying as these fields have come into the picture? We probably won't have chance to come back and have a large group discussion, but we'll be around sort of chat with you because we're really intrigued if we're picking up on patterns. And those in the digital room, I'll do the same as what we did for Lucy's talk. I'll come and hang out on the chat function. I'm hoping Hannah online, the Carlsberg thing has also just flipped for you because you were also in the stadium on Saturday. But before we do that, just a massive round of applause for Becca and Dana. Okay, I'm going to bring the room back to convene. I have an important update from a new collaborator on our project, Dr. Hannah Dugdale, is that she did sample some alcohol-free Asahis. Pardon?
Were they branded?
Hannah, were they branded or was this when you had some hospitality?
I was going to say yes, she's.
If Hannah's ducked out to do something else now, she's going to get put on the spot, but I bet she'll be able to answer. Just a massive round of applause again to Becca and Dana for sort of giving this very whirlwind but very immediate insight into the Hannah says from bottles, but this is a point. So Mish asked this and said, "Are the 0%? Were the 0% perfect? So now I don't need to go to the supermarket." Thanks, Hannah. Okay, so just to wrap up, so we've just kind of taken some questions and comments for those in the room. Becca and Dana will be hanging out somewhat in the room next door after 4 if you want to pick some more conversations up. The sort of half conversations I was hearing were excellent. And then just to repeat kind of what's going on, because the spotlight on women in sport and this summer of women's sport more broadly is only going to continue the tidal wave of interest. So please attend some more of the Institute of Advanced Studies, either hybrid or in person. We've got a fantastic day tomorrow from our engineers. And I'm very, very excited for who Dr. Rebecca Grant and others will be hosting and presenting. Find out more by clicking on the link. We also, as I said, have the National Centre for Sport, Exercise and Medicine public lecture on the 18th of September. 24th. There we go.
12 o'clock.
24th of September at 12 o'clock. So a public lecture, for those that don't know, is when we invite someone onto campus to give almost like a TEDx style talk. So Dr. Karen Jones, as I said, is world leading in her medical field for rugby and injury and a clinician. So please come and support Karen either in person or online. You can sign up at the link. And then ways to stay connected beyond our spotlight and the Rugby World Cup activations are kind of listed below. And we will be in touch about the entity we own, which is Women in Sports, Exercise and Academic Network Conference in 2026, and also promoting our Love for Lightning fixtures, as that is a great way to continue these conversations, is by watching some of our England internationals come back and play on literally home soil. Again, just a massive shout out for everyone that has supported us the past few months and will continue to support us moving forward. Lucy gave a shout out to the Tucker Centre. If you want to find out more, we can send you on emails, and there's a couple of Tucker Centre brochures in the room next door. And just a huge thank you again to the Institute of Advanced Studies, in particular Kieran, who managed to navigate my faffing with tech, and to everyone that's set up for today. And just a huge thank you for those in the room and those in the online room. It really makes a difference when you actually come, listen and engage, and we will carry it on, or indeed bid you farewell if you're online. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.